Before the sun bled gold into the cottonwood shadows, before the town of Bitter Creek whispered her name like a warning, Elias Hartley found her standing alone in the middle of a dust-bitten road, a burlap sack tied tight over her head, and silence clinging to her like a second skin. She didn't cry for help. She didn't beg. She only gave him one rule: don't take it off. In the years since the war, Elias had learned the value of boundaries, the kind set by men with guns, and the kind set by the broken who still wanted to live. So, he didn't touch the sack. He didn't press her with questions. He only offered her the one thing nobody else had room to breathe without being seen. What began as a quiet act of shelter would soon draw the eyes of a suspicious town, the fists of men who claimed her as blood, and the kind of danger Elias had sworn never to meet head-on again. But some lines once drawn cannot be stepped back from, and some promises, especially the unspoken ones, can bind a man tighter than war. This is the story of the day Elias Hartley stayed, and the day Ruth Marlowe decided she would no longer hide. The wind had teeth that evening, sharp, dry, and relentless as it swept across the open prairie. Dust curled at the edge of the wagon trail like it didn't know where to settle. Elias Hartley pulled the reins, gently slowing his team of bay horses to a crawl. Up ahead in the middle of the road stood a figure so still, so unnaturally quiet, he thought at first it might be a scarecrow someone had forgotten to drag off a fence post. But scarecrows didn't wear burlap sacks over their heads, and they didn't whisper. She didn't move when the wind blew harder, didn't flinch or shift. The sack hung low, tied under the chin with a single knot. Her arms drooped in front of her wrists, bound with what looked like dried leather. Her dress was torn across the shoulders, cinched clumsily at the waist, and she made no sound until she did. "Please, don't look under the sack." Elias heard the words clear as day, though her voice was soft as dust. Something in it wasn't fear. It wasn't madness either. It was rule. A quiet instruction passed down from someone who'd made her believe that whatever was beneath that sack was too dangerous or too shameful to reveal. He sat still on the wagon bench for a long moment, heart ticking slow. A younger version of himself might have demanded answers, might have drawn a gun or called out louder. But Elias wasn't that man anymore. Not since the war. Not since the woman he once promised forever to had stopped writing letters, stopped waiting. He eased down from the wagon like a man approaching a spooked horse. No sudden movements, no harsh words. "Miss," he said gently, tipping his hat even though she couldn't see it. "You lost hurt." "No answer. I'm not going to touch you," he added. "Just want to make sure you're breathing." Another long silence, then again, barely a breath. "Don't. Take it off." Elias looked around. No wagon tracks, no boot prints, no dust cloud in the distance. Just the girl, the wind, and the sound of his own breathing. He didn't press. Instead, he backed the wagon slowly toward her like he was backing up to a broken-down fence post. He set a folded blanket in the wagon bed and stepped aside. "You can ride back there if you like," he said, "or walk alongside. I won't ask you questions. I'll just go slow." At first she didn't move, then just the faintest shuffle. Her feet were bare and blistered. She climbed up without a word, without ever turning her face toward him. Her hands stayed bound. Her posture curled inward like someone who didn't know how to take up space anymore. Elias climbed back onto the bench and flicked the reins. The horses snorted but moved forward. He drove slow, careful, like he was carrying something breakable. By the time they reached his ranch, tucked between two knolls of cottonwoods, the sky had turned dark and full of stars. He didn't lead her to the house. He opened the barn instead, lit a lantern, and pointed to a hay pile in the corner. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "There's water. A biscuit. Blanket, too. I'll leave you be." Still, she didn't speak. So he added one more thing before he left. "I won't touch the sack. I heard you the first time. That's enough." And with that, he closed the door and walked away, his shadow long across the dirt. That night, Elias Hartley didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with a rifle across his lap, listening to the silence in the barn. It wasn't just shelter he'd offered, it was the first boundary she'd set that anyone had honored. And in that quiet, a fragile thread was drawn between them. Something had begun. Neither of them knew what yet. But it had weight, it had shape, and it would not be easily undone. The next morning, the air hung thick with heat and silence, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a space. It holds its breath. Elias Hartley stood outside the barn with a cup of black coffee going lukewarm in his hand. He hadn't slept much. He'd spent the better part of the night sitting on the porch eyes on the barn door, watching the stars fade behind thin clouds like smudges on glass. Inside, the girl, Ruth, had not made a sound since settling into the hay. Not a cry, not a whisper. That silence carried the weight of something old, something trained, something afraid. He opened the barn door slowly, letting the morning light stretch across the floorboards like a quiet invitation. She was still there, curled on her side, wrapped in the wool blanket he'd left. The biscuit sat untouched. So did the tin cup of water. But her hands were no longer tied. The strip of leather that had bound them lay coiled beside the food like a snake that had shed its skin. Elias didn't step closer. He just stood there for a moment, the coffee steaming faintly, watching the rise and fall of her breath. Then he saw it, the sack had shifted in the night, just enough to reveal the edge of her jaw. The skin was mottled with bruises, purple fading to yellow. A pink line ran from beneath the sack to just above her collarbone. A fresh scar. Neat. Intentional. Not the kind made in a fall, but the kind left as a reminder. He crouched one knee in the straw, keeping his voice low and steady. "Ma'am," he said, like one might address a ghost or a sleeping deer, "I won't ask you to explain anything. I just want you to know. You're safe here." Still, she didn't speak. But her fingers tucked into the folds of the blanket flinched ever so slightly when he reached forward to nudge the biscuit closer. He paused, hand midair. "I ain't gonna touch you," he repeated. "Just movin' breakfast." No reply. Just that same rigid stillness, like fear had carved itself into her spine. He stood and backed out of the barn, giving her space. Let her keep the silence, if that's what she needed. He'd known men after the war who didn't talk for years, not because they couldn't, but because too many voices inside them hadn't quieted yet. By mid-morning, Elias was out chopping wood behind the house, sweat streaking the back of his shirt. The thud of the axe, a rhythm he didn't have to think about. That's when he felt it something off. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of one. The birds had stopped. No rustle in the cottonwoods. No creak of wind through dry branches. Just that quiet again. But now it wasn't coming from inside the barn. It was surrounding it. He dropped the axe quietly, wiped his palms on his trousers, and walked the side path that looped around the barn's rear. As he rounded the back corner, he caught it movement. Small. Quick. Someone ducking behind the stacked woodpile. He moved slow. No gun, just a calm presence. He'd learned long ago that rushing in only made people bolt. When he turned the corner, he saw him. A boy, maybe 12, barefoot, skinny as a rail mud caked to his calves. His shirt was torn along one sleeve, and a thin bruise bloomed beneath one eye like a shadow that hadn't faded. The boy stood frozen, shoulders taut, hands half raised, not in defense, not yet surrender, just caught, somewhere between fight and flight. Elias didn't move. He kept his voice low, even. "You with the girl?" The boy didn't answer. His eyes flicked toward the barn, then back to Elias. "She's in rough shape," Elias continued. Not accusatory, not even curious. Just a man stating what he'd seen. "I found her standing in the road with a sack over her head. She asked not to be touched. I honored that." Still the boy said nothing, but his stance shifted. Less stiff, less scared. Elias exhaled slowly, gesturing toward the porch. "There's stew left from breakfast. You hungry?" The offer hung in the air like a dare. The boy's eyes darted back to the barn again, and then one slow step forward. That was all. Elias didn't push it. He turned and walked ahead, trusting the boy to follow if he wanted to. They ate on the porch, quiet, the boy sitting on the far edge of the top step, Elias in his usual chair. The stew was thick with potato and leftover salt pork. The boy devoured it like he hadn't eaten in days. Elias didn't ask questions. "What's your name?" would come off too sharp. "Are you her brother too loaded?" Instead, he said, "She told me not to look under the sack." The spoon froze midair. The boy's mouth opened slightly. His voice, when it came, was dry and cracked. "She's not ready." That confirmed more than Elias had guessed. He nodded, letting the moment pass. The next morning, the boy was gone. No tracks, no sign of departure. Just an empty bowl and a folded blanket set neatly on the porch step. But Ruth was still there. In the barn, still under the sack, still silent. And on the crate beside her was a new object, a single black thread tied in a small, perfect loop. No note, no explanation. Just that simple symbol, like a stitch waiting for a seam. Elias found himself staring at it longer than he meant to. There was meaning there. Not just survival, but memory. A kind of wordless gesture that said, "I remember what I once knew how to do. I'm not just what they did to me." He didn't disturb it, just left her another biscuit, another cup of water. And for the first time, he set down something else, a folded square of cotton fabric. Clean, soft, ready for mending or making or whatever she needed it to become. That night, as the coyotes sang far off in the hills, and the wind pushed clouds across the moon, Elias Hartley sat once more on his porch, and thought not of the war or the woman who'd left him behind, but of the girl in his barn, with her hands no longer tied, and her silence finally full of meaning. Something was happening here. He just didn't know yet if it was the beginning of healing or the start of a storm. It started with glances, whispers. Then came the questions no one asked directly, only hinted at with raised brows and lips pressed tight. The town of Bitter Creek was small, the kind of place where news traveled faster than wagons and louder than sermons. Folks there didn't need facts to build a story, just one thread of odd behavior, and they'd weave it into a tapestry of suspicion before the week was out. Elias Hartley had lived on the edge of that town for near a decade, and most had grown used to his quiet. He came in once a month, always on a Tuesday, always alone. Bought flour oats, pipe tobacco, maybe a bag of nails or a bit of lye. But now he was buying extra. A second pair of shoes, small ones. 2 loaves of bread instead of 1. More water than a man alone might drink in a week. And worst of all, a spool of thread and a handful of needles. That's what did it. Mrs. Agnes Boyle, who ran the dry goods store with the precision of a judge in court, took notice. "He hasn't mended a shirt in years," she whispered to her sister through a shelf of dried beans. "So what's he sewing now? And who's he sewing it for?" That whisper made its way to Sheriff Jed Holler within 2 days. Jed was a fair man. But fair didn't mean blind. He knew Elias didn't cause trouble, but quiet men, when they changed, raised flags. So he saddled his mare and rode out one late afternoon, the sun low and the cicadas screaming like prophets of heat. Elias was splitting logs near the edge of his corral shirt sleeves, rolled hands thick with callus and sweat. He didn't look surprised when the sheriff approached, nor pleased. Jed didn't dismount. Elias he greeted with a nod. Sheriff Elias replied, sliding his axe into the stump. "I hear you've got company." Elias didn't answer right away. He pulled a rag from his back pocket, wiped the blade slow, methodical. That against the law now, Jed chewed the inside of his cheek. "They say it's a girl. Young. Wears a sack on her head. Doesn't talk." Elias looked up at that. Not defensive, just steady. Normal ain't why she's here. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "You've never been the type to keep company. Certainly not the kind that makes folks whisper." "I'm not keeping company," Elias said. "I'm offering shelter." "Shelter," Jed echoed. "You sure about this? You're stirring up talk. You don't like talk." Elias turned and looked toward the barn. It sat quiet lantern light flickering behind the slats. "She asked me not to look under the sack," he said finally. "That's more trust than I've been offered in years." Jed nodded slowly, the brim of his hat dipping. "You know what you're doing?" "No," Elias admitted. "But I know what I'm not doing, and that's turning her away." The sheriff let out a long breath and tipped his hat. "Just don't let this turn into a mess." When he rode off, Elias watched the dust trail until it vanished into the heat haze, and only then did he turn toward the barn. That night, he didn't sleep on the porch. He took his rifle and sat outside the barn door, the butt resting on his boot, the barrel angled toward the stars. He didn't speak. He didn't knock. He just stayed. At some point after midnight, a whisper came through the wood slats, not a voice exactly, more a breath shaped like words. "I used to sing," Ruth said. "Before." Elias didn't answer. He just listened the same way he had in the trenches of Vicksburg when silence meant survival. Inside, she went on. "My mother used to make me wear the sack when company came. Said I was too much face, too many questions in my eyes." Elias said nothing, but his grip on the rifle tightened. "They said no man would ever stay if he saw me." He swallowed, not loud but enough that she heard it. "I waited," she whispered. "So long. For someone to stay." A beat passed. Then Elias's voice, low, ragged. "I'm still here." Silence stretched between them again, but it was no longer sharp. It softened at the edges, like cloth worn smooth from years of use. By morning, the biscuit he'd left was gone. The fabric square was folded neatly on the crate, and the loop of black thread remained placed now atop a single hayseed flower, dry withered but still standing. Later that week, a different visitor came. Not the sheriff this time. Thaddeus Quill, a cattle baron who owned more land than morality, rode in on a high-stepping black gelding, silver buckles shining like threats. He didn't bother dismounting, just leaned on the saddle horn and called out, "You hiding something in that barn, Hartley, or someone?" Elias didn't reply. He stood on his porch arms, crossed, watching the man like one watches a dust storm gathering. Town's nervous Thaddeus said, sneering, "Rumors say she walks around at night, that she's not quite right in the head, that you're shacked up with a witch or worse." Still, Elias didn't speak. "Maybe," Thaddeus pressed, "you've just finally gone soft, living out here with ghosts and godless girls." That was when Elias stepped off the porch, slow, deliberate. His boots hit the ground with weight. "You call her that again," he said, voice low and even, "and you'll find out just how godless I can be." The sneer left Quill's face. "You think you can stand against what's coming?" Elias stared him down. "Let it come." Thaddeus clicked his tongue, turned his horse, and rode off in a spray of grit. But the warning stayed behind like smoke that wouldn't clear. That night, Elias checked the barn again. Ruth was sitting up this time, the sack still on, but her head tilted toward him like she'd been listening. She whispered one thing before he could speak. "They're coming." His blood went cold. "Who?" She didn't answer right away. Her hands clenched around the edge of the blanket. Then, barely audible, "My brothers." And out beyond the ridge where the prairie met the night, Elias heard it too. Not the wind, not the coyotes, but something slower, heavier, hoofbeats. The sound came just after nightfall. Low, deliberate hoofbeats moving not at a gallop, but in that steady, unhurried rhythm that said one thing loud and clear: "We know exactly where we're going." Elias Hartley stood outside the barn with his rifle leaned against one thigh, pipe smoke curling over his shoulder like a warning spirit. The dogs in the canyon below had gone silent. Even the wind had stilled. That kind of quiet didn't come often in open country, and when it did, something always followed. Inside the barn, Ruth hadn't moved. She was seated on the crate as she had been the night before, sack still draped over her face, though her hands now rested openly in her lap. She had not asked for protection. She had only whispered, "They're coming." Now, as the faint silhouettes of 4 riders emerged over the ridge, the truth of those words thickened the air. They didn't come up the main path. They circled. First around the corral, then toward the back edge of the barn. They didn't bring torches, no lanterns, just darkness, muscle, and memory. Men who didn't need light to find what they believed was theirs. One of them called out, his voice rough, leaning into cruelty like it was habit. "Evening, old man. We're just here for what belongs to us." Elias didn't reply. He simply shifted his weight and brought the rifle up to rest across both hands, not aimed, not yet, but ready. Another voice, younger Mina, pushed through the dark. "You think you get to keep a Crawford girl like some stray mutt you dragged off the road?" Still, Elias said nothing. He didn't need to speak to stake his ground. His silence had weight now. A pause, then hooves moved forward again. One rider dismounted, a broad-chested man with a hunting knife strapped low and a scar cutting clean across his neck like a half-closed warning. He stepped into the lantern light, sneering. "She ain't yours," he said flatly. Elias stepped off the porch, slow and calm. "She's under my roof." "That makes her my responsibility," the man scoffed. "You know what she is?" Elias nodded. "A human being." "No," the man growled. "She's damaged. She was always off. Too quiet, too soft. Mama said she was cursed. Daddy said no man would ever want her." "She's not livestock," Elias replied. The man spit into the dirt. "We didn't kill her, Hartley. That means she's still ours. That's the way of things." Behind him, the others watched from their horses, silent. Shadows waiting for a reason to turn sharp. Inside the barn, the door creaked open. Elias didn't turn at first. He didn't need to. He felt the air shift. Ruth stepped out, slowly, steady. Sack still on barefoot, her hands trembling, but not her voice. "My name," she said loud enough to reach the edge of the corral, "is Ruth Marlowe." The men froze. The night held its breath. She said it again. "Ruth, that's the name I gave myself when you stopped giving me one." One of the riders laughed bitterly. "That's not your name. That's just something you stole." Ruth ignored him. She turned slightly toward Elias, hand outstretched, fingers brushing the edge of his coat. He didn't flinch. "You said no one would ever look at me and stay," she said. "But he did." The scarred brother took a step forward. "You're coming with us. We ain't here to argue." "No," Ruth replied. "You're here to make sure I disappear again, just like before. She reached for the knot at her chin. Elias whispered, "You don't have to." But she nodded. "I do." With both hands she untied the cord and pulled the sack away. What it revealed didn't make the men recoil in horror. What it did more painfully was make them see her for the first time. Her face was not ruined. It was marked. Scars crisscrossed her brow and cheek. One eye bore a thin patch. Her lip had healed crooked from an old split, but her spine was straight. Her jaw was set. She wasn't hiding anymore. "You did this," she said. "Each of you. You made me feel like I had to earn silence." The youngest brother, barely more than a boy, shifted in his saddle. "Ruth, I didn't—" She cut him off gently. "You watched." He looked down. Elias stepped forward now, his voice calm. "She's not your burden. She's not your shame. She's not your sister, if that's what sisterhood meant to you." "She's blood," another snapped. "Then maybe you should have bled for her," Elias replied. The scarred one reached for his belt hand, hovering near the knife. "You protecting her with words, Hartley?" "That's brave. I'm protecting her with my line in the sand," Elias said. "And you just stepped over it." Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't run. She turned barefoot and steady and walked back into the barn with her head high and the sack in her hand, not as a burden now, but as a symbol of what she would no longer wear. The door shut behind her, and still the men didn't move. Elias lowered the rifle slowly, but didn't look away. "I won't chase you off," he said. "But if you stay, I'll bury the first one who steps toward that door." The threat wasn't loud, but it rang like gospel. The brothers, those who once called her cursed, who once put her in shadow, found themselves caught in a silence far heavier than anything Ruth had ever worn. A silence they couldn't fill with laughter or threat or blood. Then slowly, one by one, they turned their horses. No words, no pride, just the sound of leather and hooves fading into the night. And Elias stayed exactly where he was, because that was the difference between a man who shows up late and a man who finally stays. The days that followed were quieter than any Elias Hartley could remember, and not in the way silence used to cling to his porch like a second skin. This silence felt different, like a sigh after a long cry, like a storm that had passed and left the air sweet and changed. Ruth stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, and not because Elias asked her to, but because for the first time in years she chose to. She moved into the loft above the barn, a space once meant for hay and tools now swept clean and draped with a hand-stitched curtain. She hung herself. She said little, but her movement spoke more than words. Every morning Elias found the blanket folded, the coffee gone. The crate by the barn wall now held small things, patches of cloth, a wooden spool, a jar of buttons. She had started sewing again, not to hide, not to fix, but to create. Quiet acts of reclaiming. In the afternoons, she'd walk the fence line, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scarred hands steady as she helped Elias repair breaks in the wire. Sometimes they worked without a word. Other times, she'd speak in fragments, a memory about a blue dress once torn, or the way her mother used to braid her hair too tight. Elias never pushed. He just listened. And slowly, something began to shift between them. Not romance, not yet, and maybe not ever, but recognition. A kind of still companionship that grew in the soft places silence used to hurt. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the cottonwoods and painted the land in hues of rust and fire, Elias came back from checking the stock to find Ruth standing barefoot near the edge of the corral. She was facing west, the breeze tugging her hair from its braid. The sack was gone now, buried weeks earlier beneath a cedar tree out back. She'd never said a word when she did it, just walked with it in her arms like an offering and returned without it. Now she stood with her face uncovered, the last rays of light falling over the faded map of scars. Her spine was straight, her chin lifted, and in that moment she looked more free than Elias had ever seen any living soul. He leaned on the fence beside her. "Nice night," he said. Ruth nodded slow. "I forgot what the wind feels like, when you're not afraid of being seen." They stood there a while, neither moving. A hawk drifted overhead, its cry sharp and solitary. Finally Elias cleared his throat. "I rode into town yesterday." She glanced sideways. "Trouble, no." He paused. "Not for me. But folks still talk. They still watch." Her gaze dropped to the dust. "I figured they would." "You deserve more than being stared at like a warning sign," he said softly. "You deserve a place where your name don't come with whispers attached." Ruth didn't respond right away. The quiet stretched. "Then, you want me to leave?" "No," Elias answered. "But I don't want you to feel caged here either. Not by these hills. Not by me. You stayed because you had to. I want you to go when you're ready and to know that you can." She looked at him, eyes dark and steady. "And if I don't know where to go, we'll figure it out together." Her face cracked just a little. Something between a smile and a sob held back. Then she said it for the first time, Elias. He turned surprised at how soft it sounded when she said it, like a name prayed over. "I don't want to start over," she whispered. "I just want to begin." So they planned, quietly, without fuss. Elias helped her rebuild a wagon from spare parts in the barn, oiled the wheels, reinforced the axles. She stitched a quilt from old shirts and flour sacks, folded it with care. He packed a chest of tools and another of cloth scraps. She wrote a letter, simple and sharp, addressed to Sheriff Holler. In it she told the truth, about the brothers, the sack, the way silence had been forced upon her. She didn't name them out of vengeance, but out of finality. The truth, she wrote, deserved daylight. When the day came, it was hot and still. No birds, no wind, just that waiting hush of morning. Ruth wore a simple cotton dress cinched at the waist and a wide-brimmed hat that Elias had bought months before and never found reason to wear. She looked at the barn, then at him. "You sure about the town? It's called St. Bellamy, 2 days south. Small church kind folk. A woman runs a school there, teaches deaf children. I figure they'd know how to listen without needing to speak." Ruth didn't answer. She stepped close and wrapped her arms around him. No tears, just a long, steady breath against his chest. "All right," she said. "I'll wait," he told her. She climbed onto the bench seat, reins in hand. The wagon creaked as it rolled down the dusty path, the wheels stirring up dry earth like memories. Elias didn't follow. He stood by the barn hand, resting lightly on the post, watching her shrink into the horizon. When she vanished from view, he didn't cry, but something in him released, not grief, not even relief, just the sense that something lost had finally been named, not fixed, not forgotten, but understood. The town of St. Bellamy never knew where she came from. Just that one summer morning, a scarred woman arrived in a creaking wagon pulled by a mule with a gentle limp, a hand-stitched quilt folded beside her, and a chest of thread buttons and cloth scraps tied down with leather straps. She gave her name, Ruth Marlowe, in a voice quiet but unwavering. No one asked for more than that, and she never offered what wasn't needed. She rented a back room at the church, then took up work at the little school where children who couldn't speak learned to stitch patterns into fabric and stories into silence. They loved her quickly, not for her beauty, though even her scars seemed to settle into kindness, but for the way she listened. Ruth never asked a child to speak who wasn't ready. Instead, She handed them a needle pointed toward fabric and showed them how to say their name in thread. Within weeks, she had a class of 6. By winter 12, she baked bread for the hungry, mended old coats for widows, and planted herbs behind the schoolhouse that locals swore cured more than fevers. Every now and then, someone would ask where she came from. She'd smile, eyes soft, and say I was left beside a road once. Had no name, just a sack over my head and a silence that didn't belong to me. Then she'd pause, gaze out the window, and add, and then someone saw me, and stayed. Back on the ranch, Elias Hartley lived quiet, but never lonely again. He kept her room above the barn, just as she left it. Curtain-drawn quilt folded a single tin cup on the shelf. He made coffee every morning and poured 2 mugs out of habit. One sat untouched on the crate beside him, not out of grief, out of ritual, out of memory. He had not lost her. She had simply outgrown the hiding place she'd once needed. Letters came every month signed in dark blue ink, Ruth M. She told him about the students, the girl who sewed stars, the boy who signed thank you with his whole body. She told him she'd planted lavender, that she'd made peace with mirrors, that sometimes she sang again. He never wrote back much, just 1 line at a time. The south fence still leans. Your quilt's held up better than my shoulder. The porch misses your silence. And every letter ended the same way, still waiting if ever you want to come home. But he knew she already had, because home wasn't always a place you stayed. Sometimes it was the person who gave you back your name. And so long after the firelight dimmed and the wind wore down the barn wood, the people of St. Bellamy would still speak of the woman with the quiet smile and the hands that healed through thread. Not a legend, not a mystery, but a fact. Her name was Ruth, and she was never invisible again. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, subscribe, and share Whispers of the West. Every tale we tell honors the quiet strength, redemption, and resilience of forgotten voices. Join us each week for more stories that linger long after the lanterns go out. Your support keeps these whispers alive.